There'll be HAL to pay in episode 12 of Super NES Works. I told you HAL was spitballing it wildly back in the early 90s trying to land a hit, and here we are. Just 3 episodes out from HAL's debut on the Super NES, Hyperzone, here's their sophomore effort, HAL's Hole-in-One Golf. Where Hyperzone was a pretty wild and out there creation, though, Hole-in-One sees the company returning to one of its core competencies, golf. Remember that HAL put itself on the map, and in Nintendo's good graces, back in the early 80s by pitching in as a ghost developer to help Nintendo get a handle on the NES and Famicom hardware. As discussed throughout NES Works 1985, the NES's 6502 processor wasn't commonly used in Japanese computers and systems. It did, however, show up in a lot of imported American machines, including the Apple II and the platform for which HAL's young genius programmer Satoru Iwata specialized, the Commodore PET. Since Iwata had taught himself the intricacies of the 6502 inside and out, Nintendo jumped to take advantage of the opportunity that he created when HAL came sniffing around the Kyoto Corporation's doors. Though uncredited, HAL's work on early Famicom software proved to be a massive boon to Nintendo and HAL alike. Iwata in particular helped Nintendo keep up its software release schedule in the early days before third parties arrived in force to flesh out the Famicom roster. And because Iwata collaborated so closely with Nintendo's old guard, folks like Shigeru Miyamoto, Hip Tanaka, and Yoshio Sakamoto, he was able to integrate into the company and command instant respect when Hiroshi Yamauchi picked him to take over for himself as NCL's president. HAL's best-known early contribution to Nintendo's efforts has long been Balloon Fight. As detailed in that episode of NES Works, Iwata's programming prowess legendarily helped the game's original programmer to create smoother, more refined flight controls that in turn became the basis of underwater movement in Super Mario Bros. Iwata also helped create Pinball, the definitive video game adaptation of pinball to that point, and he gave the Japan-only F1 race its dazzling 3D road perspective. Until recently, though, not too many people realized that HAL worked on golf for NES, too. It was only when someone discovered an emulated version of golf hidden inside the firmware of Nintendo's Switch console that HAL's role in golf properly came into public light. By fulfilling certain conditions on the anniversary of Iwata's death in 2015, which involves using the Switch's Joy-Cons to mimic his trademark direct-to-you gesture, Switch owners can unlock an emulated copy of golf. Nintendo hasn't acknowledged this Easter egg, but Justin Epperson, a localization producer at 84 Limited, brought to light the fact that Japanese fans are referring to this as an omamori, a hidden good luck talisman commonly purchased at Japanese shrines. As Iwata himself helped code golf, the NES game seems like it's a sort of charm, an invocation of the late company president's spirit to watch over the Switch. So in that context, you can understand that while Iwata's company HAL was wandering in the wilderness in its pre-Kirby days, they'd go back to the golf well, something they knew they could pull off, as opposed to the wacky wonkiness of Hyperzone. HAL basically helped define the golf video game genre back in 1984, so hole-in-one golf doesn't really do that much we haven't seen before. In fact, this would be something like the 5th or 6th entry in the company's Hole-in-One series, which began life not on a Nintendo system, but rather on home computers like MSX and Sharp X1 around the same time that Nintendo's Golf debuted in Japan. The original Hole-in-One eventually did make its way to Famicom in 1988, picking up a licensed endorsement along the way. Called Mr. Jumbo Ozaki Hole-in-One Professional, it was essentially a port of Hole-in-One Professional from MSX to Famicom, but now it was graced with the name of Japan's biggest golf star. Standing 5'11", Masashi Jumbo Ozaki was somewhat tall by Japanese standards of the 60s and 70s when he made his name, but his nickname had more to do with his outsized personality, a flamboyance matched by his success on the links. His performance on the golf course has been compared to the likes of Arnold Palmer and Jack Nicklaus, although he's never had much luck outside of Japan itself. HAL's Hole-in-One Golf, then, is a direct follow-up to that Famicom title. In Japan, it was simply called Jumbo Ozaki no Hole-in-One, pretty much the same as its 8-bit predecessor. Few people outside Japan were familiar with Ozaki though, so HAL understandably dropped the endorsement when the game shipped to the US and Europe. Rather than find a local golf hero to attach the game to, HAL replaced Ozaki, the indefatigable challenger you must overcome in match play mode, to a dude named HAL. Facing off against HAL is ridiculously challenging. He's a practically flawless golfer, which I suppose is to be expected as the localized version of Japan's most successful golf pro of all time. If you do somehow manage to best him though, he gives you a password that will allow you to play with his personal set of metal clubs. Again, HAL Labs, along with Nintendo and Sega, essentially perfected the video game golf genre back in 1984 with Famicom Golf, Hole-in-One for MSX, and Ayako Okamoto's Match Play Golf. If you've seen any golf game produced since then, Hole-in-One Golf for Super NES holds few surprises for you. The game contains all the standard modes. Besides match play against Jumbo Ozaki's whitewashed pro, you can also hit the links solo or against another player. There are unusual quirks, like the way the game gives you a password anytime you achieve an ace or an albatross, so you can bask in your glory all over again. It might seem weird to include a password for such a specific feature without also including something like, say, a career mode or permanent rankings to track. But again, HAL is reputedly struggling financially at this point, so it makes sense that Hole-in-One Golf feels like the company's attempt to pad its revenues with a nice, safe, profitable release, which meant not putting more effort into the design of the game than absolutely necessary, and definitely not springing for a pricey cartridge ROM with a battery-based save feature on board to keep track of all this stuff. Still, don't take this to mean that HAL's conservatism resulted in a dull or lazy game. This is a solid golf sim, albeit one with a somewhat transitional look. It has that weird 16-bit era visual style that wobbles unsteadily between traditional hand-drawn pixel graphics and digitized textures and photos, especially in close-ups of putts. But the larger view of the game gives you a ridiculous amount of information for your approach to the green. Not only do you get a fancy Mode 7 flyby, you can also examine each fairway with a layered isometric view that allows you to study its topography from multiple perspectives. I also appreciate how HAL has updated the classic swing meter here. Rather than appearing as the usual straight line, it now consists of a semicircle that represents the arc of your golfer's swing. While it's still something of an abstraction, the idea of engaging the meter at a critical point of your swing feels more intuitive and natural. As a nice touch, the putting meter is also much smaller than the swing meter, reflecting the nature of these different actions. There's only so much you can do with these standard boilerplate elements of golf, but HAL's made the best of it. The Mode 7 flyby is particularly interesting because it reveals one of the game's more notable, if subtle, features. Hole-in-One Golf features an entire golf course rendered as a single continuous space. Each hole sits in relation to the other, which isn't something that really factors into the game itself. It's not like you have to drive a cart from hole to hole or anything. But it does speak to HAL's desire to bring a certain level of verisimilitude to their simulation of the sport. The game's manual breaks from the Super NES standard format in order to reflect the structure of the game space. Rather than taking the form of a booklet, Hole-in-One Golf's manual instead comes as a fold-out poster. One side breaks down the play mechanics, while the reverse side shows off the entire course layout. I don't doubt that this also helped cut costs a bit. A single double-sided sheet probably saved a few pennies off the game's production expenses versus a multi-page booklet. And that's precisely why HAL has always been such a perfect partner for Nintendo. Like the bigger company, they put a lot of love into their creations while also being completely miserly. Like all sports games of this vintage, HAL's Hole-in-One Golf doesn't offer much reason for modern players to return to it. But it stands up well compared to contemporary efforts in the same genre. Loaded with neat little details and a semi-secret connection to a legendary Japanese golf pro, HAL's Hole-in-One Golf is totally fine. And that's just fine. Next on Super NES Works, Peter Molyneux has everyone up in arms, but deliberately for once.